Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event co-sponsored by the School of Public Policy and the Data Science Institute at the LSE. And today we're very, very honored and pleased and lucky to be hosting my friend Reid Hoffman. Reid, it is absolutely great to have you here. I will not read his bio, you know it. He is, of course, one of the technology leaders, not just of the US, but in the world at large. Started a bunch of companies, didn't do badly. And very importantly, he was not among the technology leaders at the White House on Inauguration Day. And I suspect he's in a better place. And I suspect we may hear a bit about that. But the main subject of today, of course, is not politics, it's Reid's new book, Superagency, What Could Possibly Go Right with Our AI Future. So we're going to talk about technology, we're going to talk about AI, and we're going to talk about what AI could do. And Reid will make a case, I think, I'm pretty sure, because I've read the book, that lots of things could go right. So Reid, first of all, welcome. We're very, very happy to have you here. Let's begin waxing lyrical.
This mic is on.
Good.
It is. Yes. All right.
There we
Keep
go.
going. Yes.
So give us the best case scenario. Tell us how and why our lives could be better, say 2, 3, 5 years from now, as a result of the mass introduction of AI.
So with current line of sight with AI, and so thank you for the shorter time frame, 2, 3, 5 years. That's much better. The best way to look foolish is to try to make a 10-year prediction in technology. And I try not to look foolish, although as an American, I'm willing to. And so a medical assistant that's better than your average GP, general practitioner, on every cell phone, available 24/7. A tutor on every subject, for every age, that's also available on your cell phone. A legal assistant, and then a variety of co-pilots and aides in terms of how you work. And frankly, actually, I think by the time you get to 5 years, I think that anyone who works with language, if they're not using one or more co-pilots for what they're doing, they will be undertooled. That includes deans, that includes investors and entrepreneurs, that includes students. And one of the things to just kind of begin to get this, actually, I'll tell a story because you actually were around when I was showing a tool Gawande, deep research.
Right.
Because this is actually, I think, a very illustrative story for academics. So
after that day, I went and got deep research.
Yes, exactly. And so I sat down with the tool, a celebrated author, Checkpoint Manifesto, former deputy director of the USAID. And I was like, have you used deep research yet? And he said, no. And I said, okay, what's an intellectual project you're working on? He said, well, I'm working on a book on the history of anesthesiology and how it improves surgical practice. And I'm looking for first-person accounts on kind of like how it improved surgical process. I said, great. And I sat there and in 3 minutes, I constructed a prompt. And then 10 minutes later, a report came back that he looked at it and said, oh my God, this is gold. And I said, well, let's send it to your research assistant, right? Let's make sure. Now, it came back with 10 quotes, and I was expecting 3 of them to be hallucinations. And generally speaking, most academics, when they were, oh, there's one hallucination, it's a useless tool. Now, as it turned out, 9 of the 10 quotes were hallucinations. But the research assistant was smart and looked at the areas that it was pointed to and said, this was gold for me because it would have taken me tens of hours to find the source materials and all the rest that this was pointing me to. This was enormously advancing. And so the mistake that academics frequently make is they say, well, look, it makes a mistake. A mistake is heretical. It has nothing to do with academia. And you're like, actually, in fact, this is an instance of how it accelerates knowledge, research, and creation already today. Now, within 2, 3, 5 years, that hallucination count will be way down and the capabilities will be way up.
Well, academics who feel that way clearly didn't have any training in statistics, right? Economists, social scientists would say, you want to be right 95% of the time, 97% of the time. nothing, no one is right 100% of the time.
Yes.
So let's carry on with this, the topic of how things could go well. I'll get later on to questions about how things could go badly, but let's wax lyrical for a minute here. The title of your book is very suggestive. When people think about technology, those who are more negative, more pessimistic, tend to think technology is great, but it sort of takes over our lives, right? We lose agency, we lose control. Control is important. We're in a country that left the EU because people here wanted to seize back control. Your title would seem to suggest that, in fact, with AI, we can do that. We can have super agency. We can seize back control. Tell us a bit about that.
So agency in new technologies always transforms. So it doesn't mean your agency is only what it was before and new things. It transforms. So a very simple example is when we started the automobile revolution, of course, a bunch of things around horses, agency dropped. If your job was being the driver of a horse and buggy carriage, your job transformed. If people said, hey, I really like horses because I could go anywhere, I didn't have to just stay on roads, I could go across, it was available. There was a whole horse industry, which is now, even in this country, a little bit diminished, although obviously you can walk around London and see horses. And so it transforms. But on the other side of that transformation, it's massively larger. So when you think about cars, you say, well, now, actually, in fact, your distance you can travel, where you can go, is now your superpowers of mobility are now much higher. And ultimately, of course, it starts with, the cars start with only wealthy people and then generate, but it generates to everybody, right? So people say, well, the first car is unequal. Yes, but that's the dissemination of how this plays. And part of the super agency plane is that part of what happens with our agency is it's not just when I get a car that my mobility goes up. It's also when other people get cars, that also gives me superpowers. And that's part of the super agency. And so think about it this way. If you say, okay, a doctor, like when cars are created, I can now drive and go see the doctor, but the doctor can also drive and come see me. And that drive and come see me is part of a superpower for me or for my kid or for my partner or for my grandparent or all of these things. And that's part of the super agency. And that's part of what the elevation of agency is.
So you mentioned kids. You didn't say the word addiction, but if you have kids, and I do, sometimes you worry that technology can be addictive, right? Some of the naysayers would make the case, and I don't know if it's the right case or not, but I'd like to hear your views on it, that if we are addicted, to TikTok, we will be much more addicted to the kinds of things that AI can do, and therefore we have a loss of agency, not a gain. Tell me why that's not the case.
So usually kids develop the kind of antibodies to new technologies. So this discourse around TikTok specifically is very much like the discourse around television, right? And you remember, like it's going to be the idiot tube, it's going to make us all an idiots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to considerations around its productive participation in human life. And for example, by the way, this kind of concern when the phonograph was first created, the way it was that, oh, this will be an evil thing reproducing people's voices. And it was like, no, it's great because church sermons, everyone can listen to them at home. And of course, that's what everyone does with their LPs. And so that addiction language, I think, is mostly tends to be much more draconianly stated. It's kind of more of a 3 out of 10 issue that's described as an 8 out of 10 issue, where the 3 out of 10 issue is real, should be navigated, but it is not like kind of the end of the world. Now, there's much more sophisticated questions around social networks. Like, for example, our collective media systems need to be learning mechanisms for us because that's how we function in a society, in a democracy. And so the notion that we have, social media stuff that allows a heavy anti-vax belief is nutty, given that all the evidence, all the scientific work, everything else suggests that vaccines in whole are extremely good. Now, obviously, there can be a specific vaccine or some
There are
specific
members of the
things.
Trump administration who don't see it that way, but yes.
Yes, well,
they are very valuable.
yes. Well, pre-confirmation, and I regret that I'm probably going to be proven right on a podcast. What I said about RFK Jr. was his confirmation will be measured in thousands of lives lost, and we'll probably have that as a function of that. Now, I think that the question is on, like, for example, TikTok is, I think, less addiction. I think addiction will be managed very well. And that's, again, 3 out of 10, not 0, but more in the question of information flows. What do you believe to be true? How do you understand the world and the universe? And I think that the fact it isn't that look, we can't get it so there's never wrong or false information. I mean, I certainly can sometimes have false beliefs too. It's that the system is a collective learning mechanism, and that collective learning is very important.
I'm going to return to the issue of misinformation when we talk about democracy, but let me hold that thought for a minute. One last question, Reid, on potential. There are lots of people doing economics and finance in this building, so let's talk about economic potential. You and I know this guy, Nouriel Roubini. He's a good friend of ours. He's known as Dr. Doom because he's always making very gloomy predictions, except on AI. He wrote a piece last week, and I have the title here. The title of the piece is "America's Economic Tailwinds Will Override Trump and His Tariffs." And the tailwinds are all about productivity, and they're all about AI. So how do you think about this? Leave Trump aside for a minute, but is the effect on productivity going to be as large as our typically gloomy friend Roubini is forecasting?
Well, I'll have to go read it because I don't think I've ever read anything positive by Nouriel. So that is
neither had I. So that's why I'm quoting it. It was quite a shock.
Exactly. I agree with him because I think that the notion, I mean, I don't think right now AI is being deployed in a way that would hit the productivity numbers, but I think that is a small n number of years. Now, part of it, as you know, the productivity numbers are weirdly measured.
Yes.
Because the way that, like, GDP, et cetera, measures doesn't include a lot of value that comes out of information flows, not just
and the quality adjustment.
Yes, right. So, but, like, for example, if you went to the earlier things I was mentioning, which is like today, you could have a medical assistant, tutor, legal assistant, all running at very low cost, available to everybody. And I think that's part of, like, one of the things I'm very positive on is Ezra Klein's and Derek Thompson's abundance. And I think that's part of the abundance agenda. And I think that naturally creates intense economic productivity.
As we know from the advent of the internet, it took a while for the productivity impact to show up in the numbers, right? This famous quote by Samuelson, I think it was, computers are everywhere except in the productivity figures. But give it 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, yes, they actually showed up. So I would be completely in agreement with you. We'll see it, probably not in 5 years, we'll probably see it before that. So optimism, you're optimistic about AI, clearly, a book with a title Superagency and talking about what could possibly go right is clearly optimistic, but you are a smart optimist. Your optimism is qualified. And Reid in his book has 4 categories. These are the 4 buckets in which you can put people's attitudes toward AI. He says that the world is populated by doomers, gloomers, zoomers, and bloomers. Bloomers sounds a bit nicer, so guess what? He is a self-described bloomer. So what the hell is a bloomer, Reid? And what are these other 3 attitudes toward AI?
So in brief, doomers are AI is the end of human society and a huge destruction, and we should do everything possible to stop it. And there are a number of them. And by the way, I am not slandering them by calling them doomers. This is, to some degree, how they name themselves. So, like, for example, I've been in conversations where it is bandied about what is your P-doom, e.g. probability of doom. And so, I felt, okay, fine, if you're labeling yourself, I'm not being, insulting with the category. Bloomers is AI is inevitable, but it will be bad. It'll be, heighten inequality. It'll do damage to the environment. It will, involve a lot of different job transformation that's not at the end of the day positive, through the transition process, et cetera, et cetera. It'll perpetuate society's biases. It's kind of a stack of these things, and it'll be bad. It's inevitable. It will be constructed, but it'll be bad. Zoomers are, it's gonna be glorious, and we should just close our eyes and accelerate to the future. Anything that we could possibly build is awesome, and we should get out of the way of anyone who's building anything because it'll be awesome. And by the way, I have actually even been interviewed by people who identify themselves as Zoomers. So there's also in that category. And then
they call themselves that after reading your book. They said, "Oh,
yes,
that's me."
Yes,
right,
exactly. Okay. Right. So it was a little bemusing,
right.
as clearly my book was not persuasive in this context. And bloomers, which are, yes, the future can be very good. It is not like a hard thing to navigate to a much better future, but we should navigate intelligently. We should navigate the risks. We should figure out how to steer. Like using the driving metaphor, when you get to the sharp corner, slow down for the sharp corner. When you see a pothole, slow down, drive around it. But you are trying to get to the future. And by the way, you're not trying to get to the future driving at 5 miles per hour, because if you're driving at 5 miles per hour, you'll just not get there very fast. And both the benefits, medical assistant, et cetera, and also the ability to navigate the risk will be much stronger in the future. And so you want to get there and drive there, but drive intelligently.
So let's try to put a little more meat on what it means to drive intelligently. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea, I sort of said it already, that zero risk is not a sound proposition, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. There's risk in everything we do. I'm a trained economist, so the way I think about it is you take on risk to the point where the marginal gain from the risk, the gain from having one more unit of risk, whatever that might be, equals the gain from, the good stuff that I get from AI. Now, with most technologies, with most human endeavors, I can quantify these things because I've seen them before, right? How dangerous is it to smoke? Well, I can see what the incidence of smoking is on disease. I have a probability, and I can say, okay, I will smoke or not smoke or smoke a little bit. In this case, it's all brand new, so we don't have these probabilities. We can sort of conjecture what they might be. So you introduce a concept in the book, which I thought was interesting, but I really want to hear more about it. You talk about iterative deployment, which I imagine is a bit of dealing with this problem. Am I guessing right?
Yes, absolutely. So iterative deployment is deploy, get feedback from people using it, and iterate. Now, a lot of people, for example, academics tend to argue against it, saying, oh, precautionary principle, until you know, you shouldn't deploy it all. But the problem is you don't learn. Think about, again, cars. If you said, I'm going to put it wasn't initially 2 tons, but I'm going to put this heavy metal object on the road, and it's going to be driving, and there could be accidents, and could be a bad driver, could be a drunk driver, et cetera. Then what happens is say, oh, we can't do any of that until we've answered all those questions. And you get a punch list of 1,000 safety items, and we never have cars. By the way, similarly with electricity, like, for example, we're addicted to electricity. That's not such a bad thing, and it's pretty essential, right? And so it was like, oh my God, it'll burn things down. And by the way, it will burn things down. But the only way you get to the right safety features is by a kind of an iterative deployment mechanism. And so, for example, with cars, the market naturally added, airbags, crumple zones, et cetera, as you're doing it. And sometimes as you're seeing it being developed, you go, oh, this thing needs to be added. One of the places where government and regulation come in is seatbelts. The consumers, none of them wanted seatbelts. So the manufacturers go, we don't want to have to hassle with this. We have no consumer demand. We don't want it. It makes sense at that point when we're seeing what's going on and we have the economist metrics on, well, actually, in fact, if we have seatbelts, then the hospitalizations, injuries, et cetera, and the cost of it, we're going to put the regulation on the car saying, not only do you have to have seatbelts, but eventually you have to beep at people until they put it on. And that's all part of iterative deployment, because you wouldn't have known about seatbelts in advance without going through the cycle of deploying it and seeing what's happening. And that's what should be happening with AI. Now, the good news is that is what's happening. That's with ChatGPT and, Claude and Gemini and Pi and all of these things. That is exactly what's happening, and I think that's a good thing.
That sounds very reasonable, and I'm a buyer of the idea. But if I put on my hat as a former politician, the politics of that is not so easy, right? Because if you tell, if I produce the Prime Minister of the UK, Adam Hare, what you're saying is be out on the look for problems we don't yet know will exist.
Yes.
Some will exist, but we don't know what they are,
Yeah.
and have some mechanism for detecting them and then acting and correcting them.
Yes.
It's very reasonable. I'm all for it. Political systems don't do that very well, do they?
Well, this is part of the reason I write Superagency, do a podcast like Possible, is to get people to realize that the future can be so much better. That's the reason why we open with, like, for example, the advice that I give, 10 Downing Street and other places, get that medical assistant created. Like, I understand what the possible benefits are because I see some of it, I'm participating in it. That's a good thing. Yes, I particularly understand it's like there's one, for example, automobile crash, and you go, this is the instance. And are you government leaders, former minister, doing the right thing to protect us? And it's politically, anxiety producing.
Notice that our friend and leading technologist, when he wanted to convey his ideas, wrote a book. Pretty old-fashioned thing. I'm glad you're writing books. I'm going to copy this.
I know there's still 5 people who read them.
Yeah, maybe 6. Actually, no, everybody in this room. That's about 250 right here. Actually, I'm going to steal this question from another podcast or an interview you did in London not too long ago. The person interviewing you said, what is a technology doing writing books? Do you really trust books? Are books still a good way to convey ideas?
So there's a couple of things that are good about books, although they are very old school.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with old school.
Yeah.
We are in a school. We like old school.
Yes. Yeah, we're literally in an old school.
Yep.
The first is obviously organizing your own thinking, and really going through it. The second is being the basis for dialogues, this one, others, by which when you are considering things very seriously and saying, like, how do we take smart risks? Which risks would we take? Why is it important to be positive or negative on different things? The detail of the argument really matters. That also ties to people who are thoughtful about this tend to read and tend to be willing to go, okay, if I take your position seriously, now I'm willing to engage with the book, see what it is. All of that's good. Now, my advice to people, as I've given you, is a book is now insufficient for the spread of ideas. And it's part of the reason I do a podcast Possible, because part of the thing I think if anyone's going to write a book, they should also have a podcast strategy. I think they should have a social media strategy. I think they should have a LinkedIn strategy.
I'm publishing a book, and I've been told this repeatedly by Reed. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Because the book is an essential case for all of those other purposes. But the problem is, and I'll use an entrepreneurial parallel, is if your thought is, I just publish the book and I throw it out there and I see what happens, that frequently has well under the impact you hope in all of the energy you put into a book. So I think it's an important thing to also do all of those things as well, not just university talks, media tours, etc.
Yes, I've written several books. Sometimes I fear only my mother read them. So we will change the publicity strategy from now on. So this is fun. I'm going to ask 2 or 3 more questions and then open it up to the audience. So please, guys, begin sharpening your questions. But there was one chapter in your book, Reed, which left me thinking, and it's a chapter called Law is Code. One of the great problems of society is that laws are not obeyed. I come from Latin America. We write laws and then we proceed to ignore them. And a similar problem is that contracts are not enforced. You and I agree that I'll give you a car, you'll give me some money, and then maybe you won't give me the money, or I won't give you the car, or the car will be lousy, right? Reed can probably put it much better than I, but this is my one-line summary. Reed argues that the technology, particularly blockchain, linked to AI, it's not AI, but it's linked to AI, will make contract enforcement easier because it will be automatic. And will make legislation naturally enforceable because it will always also be automatic. An example, I buy a car, it's a very modern car, it has sensors outside. I go to dinner with a bunch of friends. I have 3 glasses of wine. I sit in the car. I turn on the ignition. Damn car will not start. Why? Because the sensor smells alcohol in my breath. 99.9% of the time, that is a wonderful thing. There is one event in which I wish my car would start because there is a massive tsunami block away, and I really need to get the hell out of here. This example is one example of a much broader class of problems, which is writing contracts of enforcing laws when events are not foreseeable and when contingencies are not contractable. Now, I worry a lot about central banking, for instance. People say, why have a central bank? Just have a rule. Whenever inflation is X, the interest rate should be Y. But we have discovered that those rules work very poorly because we need a little human judgment that gets in the middle that says, oh yeah, much of the time you want to increase the interest rates, but not right now because we have a pandemic or we have this or we have that. So this is a case in which we will have less human agency, not more human agency, for very good reasons.
Yes.
How do we deal with those cases in which we need a human being still in the middle?
So the first part of it is, like, for example, it's a very good example, and I love the argument, is obviously part of the reason why you say we're not going to allow you to drive when you're intoxicated is because that is potentially very destructive to a lot of other human beings' agency. You run over a child, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a reason to say that when you say the increase of agency is not just like, I can do everything. It's like what happens across the whole thing.
Yeah.
Now,
to have agency, you need the rule of law.
yes. And so, so generally speaking, now I think you're like the way I would mod now what I wrote, because I think it's a good argument, is say, sure, and the car should also have a button that says, I'm declaring an emergency and I need to drive. And it goes, fine. And it registers everything and it sends it to the police station saying, Andre has said, overrule my drunken driving, I'm going. Fine. You take accountability and responsibility for it. If you have made a bad judgment, or if you said, well, I'm pretending there's a tsunami, there isn't really one, you will probably have some consequence for that. But it's good to have that kind of ability, because I agree with you about human judgment. I do think that one of the things that when we get to this, I actually think that most of the cases are things that you want to allow a broad range of human judgment in. I think it's just kind of cases where you can now say for things that are just like the seatbelts, that are particularly have to do with potentially thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of injuries or even more, hey, you can actually make the law work a little bit better.
Actually, the way out you suggest is exactly what central bankers do. In some countries, New Zealand, for instance, is a target. The inflation should be 2%. And if the central bank president decides not to hit or cannot hit the 2%, has to write a letter to parliament. And in fact, in some countries, the central banker could have some money deducted from his or her salary if they didn't quite do what they were supposed to do. So that's sort of the analogous case of my story goes to the police and the police will find me.
Yes.
So let's, we've sort of gotten into politics sort of through the back door. Let's stay with politics for a minute. You're a guy who worries about politics. So am I. So naturally, one has to ask the question, what will be the impact of AI on politics? On the one hand, having more agency, having more productivity, being more prosperous, being more informed, one would like to think must be good for politics. Informed citizens typically make better decisions. We would like to think. On the other hand, not too long ago, we have had some pretty nasty surprises, I would argue, concerning the relationship between technology and politics. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we all thought that social media would bring a new era of democracy. To some extent it did. It's easier to organize a demonstration if I can, WhatsApp my friends. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that, the quality of democratic debate is not exactly thriving, and probably social media has a bit to do with that. So, AI and politics, bloomer, doomer, zoomer, what are you?
Well, bloomer for sure. And look, obviously I would hope, it's very difficult to do, to direct it politically, but like some of the arguments that I've made is that we want to actually, within all social media, have a learning system towards truth. Like,
Right.
for example, you can both have freedom of speech, which is, I want to post this thing that says vaccines cause autism. But then the system would say, hey, there's been a bunch of scientific research on this. It all finds it negative. So you can post it, but we're going to put it with a little box saying, this is contrary to scientific wisdom. Look over here in order to find it, and that kind of thing. And obviously, we have to be selective and very careful through truth mechanisms that we use, such as science, other kinds of things as ways of doing this.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but parenthetically, if you say this is what professors believe, that may make the statement, in fact, more attractive or less attractive, depending on who you are, right?
Yeah.
There are many people in the world today who don't like professors
Yes.
or scientists or experts.
Yes, well, they should stop using modern medicine. That might help the world. Sorry, that was a little cruel.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
You know, they live in a much safer world because of expertise, and they need to learn. It doesn't mean the experts are always right.
Yeah.
By no chance. Even experts will tell you experts are not right. That's the reason why we have studied reflection. But a belief in refining and using expertise is an extremely important belief that we need to hold on to. That is what scientific method is, among other things. And so that's the reason I use anti-vax as the classic example here. Now, I do think that the question with AI is very parallel, which is, if you have AI today, which is learning on a whole bunch of different things and is used to be trained, doesn't mean it doesn't hallucinate, but if it can be a guide to helping you learn and discover truth, that can be extremely effective. And, you know, obviously there's a lot of things where truth coefficient is hard to assess. Like, an easy one is medical studies on vaccines. It gets harder when it gets to questions around, for example, politically contentious questions. Like in the US, is the 2020 election stolen or not, et cetera. But by the way, even there, like expert debate in study can resolve to something that says, this is actually, in fact, something that shows truth. Because you can say, great, like, for example, if we say we have, you know, some people in the US who claim that the 2020 election is stolen, it's great. Let's have a public commission that consults lots of experts, goes into depth on this, and generates a report with citations, findings, et cetera, on it, and then we can have the truth of it and we can know. Not just a political statement. That's the kind of thing that you want to essentially have. Now, if you have that kind of thing underpinning the baseline about, are AIs giving truthful results, then you can actually, in fact, have this be a very helpful thing for democracy. But of course, we have to have a commitment to truth finding, which we seem to have lost our way a great deal.
I couldn't agree more that having more info will be better than having less info, and that truth finding is important. But a little bit less optimistic than you are on how much people really want to find out the truth. Or to put it more academically, you know, a belief plays two roles. A belief is a statement about the world, and, you know, if vaccines are good, I better believe it. But if I believe that vaccines are no good, that also makes me part of a group. I identify with a group. I have my friends. I have my buddies. It provides a social environment in which I live. And sometimes maybe the latter has more weight than the former. I mean, that's one way to read politics today in the world, isn't it?
Absolutely. And by the way, of course, most people would rather have confirmation bias, rather have,
of course,
like what I believe is true, et cetera, et cetera. And few people have the rigor of the scientific method and arguing. Now, a positive sign relative to the AI agents is, I think late last year, there was some scientific results, or social science, published that.
Notice that he said scientific results and then social science just a little bit further down.
Yeah, just making sure that there was it's not like physics or chemistry. It's just, you know, but studies that ran some longitudinal studies on persuading people out of conspiracy beliefs. So conspiracy beliefs, the moon landing was faked, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And what it found was that in AIs, in discussion with conspiracy theory believing folks, could convince those people, 25% of those people, to change their mind for the length of the study, which is 6 months, for 6 months away from the conspiracy theory. And I think that's because AI has a bunch of different positive features that human discourse doesn't, which is, we have resistance for, well, when Andre tells me something, it's like, no, like, you're challenging me. This is a which of us is right kind of thing. When the chatbot's doing it, the same kinds of things don't necessarily get there. The chatbot's also more patient, especially than Andre. Yes, exactly. And we'll do it in very micro steps. Like, well, why do you think the moon landing's fake? What led you to that? And, oh, that's an interesting thing. Where did you read about that? And, and did you cross-check it? Have you thought about it? What would be the other things that would be true if the moon landing was actually fake? And do you think people could hide that? Like as kind of as a way of getting it, and gets people to the position where they go, oh, wait, I've changed my mind. And that's the kind of thing that makes me still in the optimist bloomer camp.
No, you've said one thing that had not crossed my mind before, which is sometimes I don't like the idea because I don't like the person conveying the idea.
Yeah.
But a chat box is hard to hate.
Yes.
At least a chat box you've never met before, right?
Yes.
So maybe I will be more willing to take the truth, whatever that might be, from the machine that I would be from the guy across the street.
Well, especially because the machine can spend an hour in patient conversation talking to you about your beliefs. People mostly like to talk about themselves and their beliefs, and help you evolve and think about that in a direction that might be actually truth finding.
So the machine would be a very good politician. When I became a politician, a much more senior politician took me aside and said, whenever you go to parliament and whenever you're asked a question, the first thing you say is, that's a really brilliant question. Can you expound? And then when the person asking the question has done that, then you say, perhaps I will rephrase it slightly. And then you say whatever you want to say, right?
Yes.
So the chat box does that naturally.
Yes. Exactly.
It took me 45 years of my life to learn that.
So let me rephrase that.
Exactly. One last question, and then we will move on to questions from the audience. We're talking about identity. One case or example of identity is national identity. You talk about the need for countries to develop their own AIs. And maybe this is identitarian. Macron wants AI in French, not in English.
Maybe.
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 Yes. Pourquoi pas? Yes. Or maybe it's national security or economic interest, whatever. Are we going to end up with a fragmented set of AIs? Can they all be the same but have different accents and different quirks? How do we think about this?
Well, I do think that having sovereign AIs is actually, in fact, quite important. In part because AI itself is so important, whether it's the transformation of industries, whether it's how it affects national security, whether it's how it affects kind of human lives. That doesn't necessarily mean that every sovereign AI has to be like the absolute best of the best, but it gives you at the very least a safety net against changing political winds, changing geopolitical winds. I mean, imagine if, for example, one country, like let's take a hypothetical that one country is building a lot of AI and then says, we're going to impose 50% tariffs on the use of our AIs. And we're going to do it in the world.
130.
135 or whatever, 145, right, or whatever the number is. And so it's like, well, that could be destructive. And so part of it, when you have geopolitical uncertainty, I think it's useful to have core things that are grounded. And I think there's various ways to do that. And so I think that sovereign, national sovereignty in some at least sufficiently deep basis on this incredibly important technology is a wise idea over time.
But it would seem that the US and China can do this. Can everybody else do this?
Well, I think most people didn't actually realize the actual insights from DeepSeek. DeepSeek is a what is called a distilled model, which means you can build models off large models. And so there's lots of ways to build high quality models that you could say, hey, we go cut a deal with company X, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera, and we say, hey, we build some distilled models, and then those distilled models are sovereignly owned models. And because there were some innovations in DeepSeek.
You keep training them at home.
Yeah, you can train them. Look, there's a lot of like, will everyone build the massive pre-trained models? Almost certainly not, because before too long you're going to need $100 billion computer in order to do that. There won't be that many $100 billion of computers in the near future. But those will build models that can also help build other models. And those other models, a arrangement can be made.
So I have a last personal concern that I want to air with Reed. On Saturday morning, I said, I better think about some questions for Reid Hoffman. So what did I do? I went on my computer. I didn't go to ChatGPT. I went to Gemini. And I said, give me 5 questions for Reid Hoffman on the subject of his new book, Superagency. And they were pretty boring questions.
Yes. Yep.
Which made me think of one thing you say in the book. You say, AI is great, but there's one plausible charge against AI. It tends toward the cliche.
Yes.
Is that going to be a feature or a bug? Or was it simply that I maybe gave it the wrong prompt?
Well, you definitely could have prompted better and gotten good questions.
Okay.
So there's definitely a user error. As a technologist, it's the user error.
Of course.
And so, and there is...
I did try several formulations, none too sophisticated.
Yeah.
And they kept coming and they were all boring.
Yes. Well, did you say what would be, for example, the most edgy questions? Or did you say ask questions in, the style of Martin Amis? Or like, did you do any of those things?
Oh, I'm an academic. I don't do edgy stuff.
Okay. Well, because it is possible to do. And by the way, so before we kick off to audience questions, one of the important things to think about as you use AI in your own prompting, and I do this almost all the time, is I start almost all of my prompting as 2 paths. So for example, if I was doing your thing, I would have said, I want to have you write me the prompt about how to find 5 really interesting, distinctive, perhaps original questions to Reid Hoffman. And I want you to suggest me what prompt it should be and what should be the elements, like who should they be in the style of, what subjects they might cover when they're around Superagency, who would be people who would be interesting, who would disagree with Superagency, that I might base the question off of, and write me that prompt. And it will then write you a really rigorous prompt, and then you put that prompt in, and then you hit submit.
I have learned quite a few things tonight, including that one. I will go home and try that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard way too much from me, and therefore we're going to take some questions. Keep them short, please. Identify yourself. I am a progressive man, so I'm going to begin on the left. Yes, sir, right here.
Hello, my name is Biju Menon. I'm an entrepreneur, building an event aggregator like Indeed.com for jobs we're doing for events. You talked about politics and AI. My question is about humanity and AI. Because I come from a generation where I was in 80s and 90s, traveled over 50 countries. I do travel now for work to the West Coast and of course here in London. I see a pattern. The life's quality is decreasing. Mark Zuckerberg introduced Facebook. He wanted to digitally connect with friends. Now we are less connected with friends. And Sam Altman always says we want to create a better world. But we are not, we stopped thinking because we are asking artificial intelligence engines to do things for us. So are we going to hamper our capability to think and do things, which eventually can make humanity evolve to a lesser being? So I just want to know your take on that.
So this is one of the question, in case people don't get it, is like, with AI, does that on balance cause more people to be less thoughtful than people to be using this amazing, kind of learning tool?
Will the brain atrophy because we don't use it, sort of thing? Right?
Yes. And this is, again, gets down to iterative deployment, which is, say we are going down the road and we are discovering that this is actually the phenomenon. Like we actually see it, as opposed to worrying and speculating about the things. Like, oh, actually, in fact, like 70% of people are actually just kind of blindly following this stuff, not engaging, not learning. They're not making decisions themselves, or whatever percentage, but some very high percentage, even maybe 25% is too high. And then we say, okay, so what's the ways that we need to intervene in the use of AI? Now, for example, one of the ways that AI can already create a pretty amazing tutor just off the current thing is you take, Gemini, ChatGPT, et cetera, and you say, okay, meta prompt, don't give the answer. Walk the person towards the answer. And it already becomes a learning tool. So it's not actually, in fact, saying, oh, do this for me. It goes, well, how would you think about that, et cetera? And like, what would be your first answer to that? So the technology is moldable. And so rather than simply saying, hey, because by the way, some people will be lazy and do it. Some people will get behind a car drunk and drive. That when you have it, the fact that some people don't is not a relevant factor. The question is over the entire 100%, what happens across the entire thing? Now, what I have seen a lot of is, where people go, okay, I am now actually, in fact, when I'm using it, not to try to submit a essay assignment that I haven't done any work on, which of course some students are doing. I will come back to the education thing in a moment, but the fact is that like as people start engaging, it attracts them into learning. I've seen this happen lots and lots and lots. So generally in the wild, it's actually in fact very good. Now, on the learning circumstance, I think there's a transition issue as we figure out, because most university systems, most education systems go, we've been working this way for decades. We don't want to change anything. Shocker, that happens in all industries. And it will change. But I actually think education is going to get actually a lot more rigorous in the following way, which is actually, I think, within some small n number of years, I don't know if it's 3, 5, 10, assessment will actually come out by you sit in a booth with an AI and the AI does the assessment. And it will have the rigor that—
The AI does the marking as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, professors will be converts.
Yes, exactly.
Very
Yes,
quickly.
exactly. And by the way, we'll present that to the professor saying, here's why it is. So the professors can cross-check it and say, this is why, da-da-da-da, and say, okay, that makes sense. And the same reason why we only for like doctoral students and some master students and some, kind of other things, like the reason why we don't do a lot of oral assessment is because it's very expensive and very difficult to do. Now it suddenly becomes easy, and a oral defense of how you've learned and what you've learned is actually, in fact, much harder than hacking a written exam, even pre-AI, because you have to be ready to answer all the questions of the subject. So I actually think that the ultimate path in terms of education when it comes to this actually will, in fact, be a much higher rigorous sense, because I think the examinational goes, no, when we do the examination, is did you learn the subject is you sit in the booth with the AI and the AI asks you questions and how well do you do?
That's pretty cool. I mean, our parents' generation, they used to have these oral examinations, right? Then we lost them. Maybe they're coming back. Yes, right here.
Where's the
mic, please? Woman in the pink there.
First of all, thank you so much, Professor Velasco and Mr. Hoffman, for a brilliant discussion. Perhaps I'll ask you a question now. I'm Meenakshi, and I work at LSE Generate under the Research and Innovation Department at LSE. So we basically support entrepreneurs, or students, staff, and alumni to build businesses. So with the rapid rise of AI and significant funding flowing towards this space, many of our founders we see are pivoting towards incorporating AI into their ventures. Considering the vital role startups play in driving economy and also job creation, how do you see this AI-driven shift impacting the startup ecosystem and the broader economy in general?
Well, so it's already much easier to create new software code for startups than it was 1 year ago. This whole pattern called vibe coding, et cetera. And so like one of the things I think I released on LinkedIn was an example of code up LinkedIn, right? As an example, just to show it, right? As an example. And so I think that kind of productivity will generate a lot more ideas and interest and stuff. And actually just to kind of take this down kind of a level of depth, I think that with, like I already made the prognostication that within 5 years, everyone will have one or more co-pilots in any kind of information work they're doing. I think within that same 5 years, we will all have coding co-pilots, no matter what you're doing. It doesn't just mean entrepreneur, it could be lawyer, doctor, et cetera. Because if you think about the productivity enhancement we have by information communication, information analysis, et cetera, all of that is naturally done in software. So I think all of that will happen as well. And I do think that the question around, like, I think to some degree, what you'll start seeing in entrepreneurs is saying, I have this enormous toolbox within AI and software productivity. What can I do to make, kind of products, services work much better? I'll give an example that I learned from Ethan Mullick, which a few people that I would talk to a little earlier today at LSE, I'm apologies, a few of them in the audience, I will repeat, but it's useful to know, which is Ethan, professor at Wharton, was saying, look, most people don't understand how to use this multimodal AI. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, like there's a problem in construction, which is my project on time? Is it going to be delayed? Is it on budget? Is the work happening, et cetera? And, typically the way that happens right now is you send an inspector, but you send an inspector, it's difficult to arrange. The inspector kind of can look around and kind of assess stuff, but it's not there all the time. Ethan set up 20 cameras, put into an AI the project plan, and then said, give me daily updates. And it said, oh, this thing not happening right now is going to make things run over and be expensive. This work is happening really well, et cetera, et cetera. That's the kind of thing an entrepreneur can say, hey, I can make construction work everywhere better by doing this, and I can set it up and make it run right now and offer it as a service today with today's AI. So that's all of the stuff that I could see as improvements. And so I think it will be very positive. Now, part of the reason I describe AI as the cognitive industrial revolution is I think that its positive impact is the same as the way the industrial revolution came about. Like, we wouldn't have all these universities, we wouldn't have middle class, we wouldn't have wealth and prosperity so broadly without the industrial revolution. There's also the transition period, and the transition period will be difficult, and we'll try to make it less difficult, but it doesn't mean it'll be easy. And so, I don't mean to suggest this in a Pollyannish case that like the entrepreneurial unlocks, of which there will be a lot, will be without transitional difficulty, but I am very bullish in even the medium term.
Over there in the back. We'll move gradually toward that side, guys.
So we're moving right and conservative in the.
But we will come back to the center where we belong.
Yes.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I'm Zaria from the law department, first year PhD doing research in legal data modeling. And I am interested in the concept of the informational GPS that you're referring to over the book, also with the references to law. So I get the point of the value of AI in navigating the complexities that is especially relevant for what the law is doing. But I'm just wondering, how do you see the current limitations that are preventing a wider adoption in the high stakes domains such as law? And particularly, I have in mind their statistical nature. So having the non-determinism, at least under the standard settings, and the opaque decision-making process that then undermines trust.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the concept she was referring to is one of our chapters, informational GPS, which is the way to think about is a GPS for all informational analysis, decisions, et cetera. So parallel to physical world. And the question is why not, kind of why is the delays in adoption? In particular, is it because of, hallucinations, statistical judgments, and a bunch of other things? Now, one hand, by the way, the takeoff of use of this is one of the fastest takeoffs that we've seen in technological history. Now, it's partially because we're all wired on internet and mobile and all the rest, but that's part of the feature and part of where it comes from. And so the fact that we're already at, hundreds of millions of people using this is actually, in fact, a stunning statistic. Now, that being said, what happens is a lot of people in kind of classic innovator adoption issues is they kind of persuade themselves that it isn't really ready yet. It isn't really relevant yet. It isn't really, it has too many errors, et cetera. And by the way, roughly speaking, say there was a structural thing because of these things being probability computers, that there's always a percentage of errors. From a current human society perspective, that's really great. That gives a lot of room for human beings to be using them, for why you would have humans in the loop in various ways, not just because the tsunami is coming behind the car as a direction. And as part of the reason I gave the Atul Gawande story, because it was classically, a lot of people would just go, oh, 9 out of 10 errors, I'm just going to completely ignore this tool, and not actually show how it actually can be used in a really effective way. And so I think that the reason why there's slow adoption is is that most people within work, circumstance, other kinds of things, is that most people go, I'm pretty good at what I do. I'm really uncertain that it has those errors, so I don't really need to use it. I'll wait until the errors are done. And the mistake is that it is already an accelerant. Like, more or less, I don't start any conceptual project right now other than by starting with a few prompts into a few of the different chatbots. And so part of the reason why writing Superagency, doing the possible podcast, is precisely to try to address some of this question, to get people to say, become AI curious, start using it. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean you won't find things that are errors in any domain. You know, I know we'll get there. It's just a question of how fast and when.
Gentleman right there. Yes, please.
Thank you very much.
I didn't have that gentleman in mind, but that's fine.
So we'll start with that one.
You can
Go.
share it with your colleague there.
Can I still?
No, go ahead and
the
then.
question. Thank you.
Yes.
So I want to ask you, what is your views about the impact of AI inequalities? Do you see it as a positive accelerator of closing the gap, or actually of locking in the existing inequalities, or even increasing it? Also taking into account the fact that some jobs might vanish and we'll have like more unemployment and all these kind of things. Thank you.
So on the inequality, one of the things that people frequently overlook is when a technology is built for, you know, millions, hundreds of millions of people, that tends to be, doesn't mean it's evenly provisioned across all of the world, but it does mean that it has a much broader equalizing effect. So for example, you know, an Uber driver and Tim Cook might have the same iPhone, right? Because it's the same kind of hundreds of millions you're doing that. And it's one of the things that we're seeing so far with chatbot agents. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the person who is off the mobile grid, who doesn't have access to these things or other things, isn't getting a further gap that's happening because of it. But as we work towards trying to get as many of the 8 billion plus people access and involved, it has a equally provisioning broadly. Now, that doesn't mean it's still totally equal. And there may be ways that certain people may have access to AI tutors that are better than other AI, like the free AI tutor and the paid AI tutor. The paid AI tutor might be better, but that's already what we have. Like, for example, wealthy people in this society can, in any society, can afford to pay tutors for their children, and poorer people cannot. But now AI can provide for everybody and provides a baseline as an instance for doing it. So I am broadly positive, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't slow down on our effort to be as broadly inclusive as possible.
And I want to stay with this question for 1 second because it's really important. You made the point that rich and poor may have access to it.
Yeah.
But there's a second half to that question, which is, once I have it, how much does it, call it, increase my productivity? There are lots of papers which suggest that you have access to a chatbot to a bunch of people, those who have the least education may profit more because it really helps them.
Yes.
But there are also a bunch of papers that show the opposite. I'll give you one example of a PhD dissertation at the LSE. This guy looked at debating competitions in Spain, and they randomly allocated access or no access to the guys who are going to debate. And you know how debates work. They tell you the topic, you have 20 minutes to prepare it. And so you go into a room, half of the rooms had a computer and had ChatGPT, half of the rooms did not. They also had information on the grades of the participants, and they also had information on the previous performance of the participants. So you knew who was good and who wasn't so good. In that experiment, the ones who were pretty good already really took advantage of the ChatGPT. The ones who were really terrible did not. So in that case, it was unequalizing. So I can tell one story, I can tell the other, but I have no idea, how to think about which one will be prevalent.
Well, the question is what you're looking for equalizing. Because if you said, I want the same performance from everybody, you're almost reminding me of Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron, right?
No, I didn't say the same.
No, I say it. No, but
yeah.
So the fact that something might, for some people who, like, for example, make a debater a better debater, that is actually, in fact, a good outcome, even if the
Yes.
less good debater, the gap between the good debater and less good debater widens.
Oh, no, I don't doubt it is a good outcome, but the question was about equality, so I'm sticking with the question.
But equality is not between the good debater and the less good debater. Equality is between talent across all of society and having access to opportunity, capabilities, et cetera.
That's one definition, but let's
Yes.
stick with the narrow definition for a minute. I have two debaters. AI would be equalizing if the impact on the debater who initially was less good was bigger than the impact on the debater who initially was better, right?
Yeah.
That, in that particular experiment, you don't seem to.
Yeah, but I don't think that kind of, that's the reason I was referring, do you know the Kurt Vonnegut, Harrison Bergeron story? Like, well, we should put weights on the better dancer.
Yes.
So that the two dancers are dancing
of course,
equivalently.
of course.
That's not generally what is sought out in equality.
Yes.
What's sought out in equality is an equality of an ability to learn, express talent, have that kind of thing, I think, by having general access enables that.
No, the amateur political philosopher may wants to say there's equality of access, there's equality of input, there's equality of output.
Yes.
So these things have been discussed for as
Yes.
long as we've,
Yes.
we've been human.
Yes.
In the back there, yes, the gentleman in the white.
Thank you very much. I have deep misgivings about artificial information because it's not artificial intelligence. It's a form of information. And the reason I have misgivings about it is because there is no ethical framework embedded within AI. Just like in capitalism, there's no ethics, demand supply. So for example, in the Middle East, we see a democracy using AI to target so-called militants and to annihilate them at the expense of 27 innocent civilians. So how can you be positive when in the absence of an ethical framework, which is the most important feature of humanity?
Well, so generally speaking, I think that, technology can be built in a lot of different ways, and technology sometimes is argued to be, essentially value neutral, like there's no ethics in a car, and I'm positive about cars, even with sometimes there is, accidents. And so technology, of course, can be misused. A car like, for example, in Charlottesville in the US can be driven into a group of peaceful demonstrators and can be a terrible thing. And you don't then say, and we should ban car manufacturers, or we should figure out how, like, what is the ethics engaged in the car? Now, I agree about the fact that when we're in these information systems, as per earlier comments, that we want to have them being increasing the truth coefficient and the judgment coefficient. And I do think that if you look at, for example, a lot of, at least the AI groups that I'm associated with, they are trying to engage in like making the thing a more useful in terms of an elevation of humanity. So if you go to it and say, I'd like to make a weapon, it says, oh, I'm not, there's hacks and so on, but I'm not going to try to help you. Or if you say, I'm really pissed off with it'll try to figure out how to get you to adopt a more thoughtful or compassionate stance, all of which I think are in the right vectors. And that doesn't mean it's inevitably that way and all technology is that way. That's the reason I'm not a zoomer, but a bloomer in terms of how I do this. So I think it's good to articulate caution and concerns and what kinds of ways we should shape it. But that's the reason I'm fundamentally optimistic about technology.
The person had the floor before and didn't get it. Yes. Right there.
Thank you.
Yes.
Black watch.
Black watch, white shirt. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Finn and I'm a researcher in the School of Public Policy. I've got a question about admin and the gains from technology. So newer information technology often speeds up admin, but doesn't actually always reduce it. If anything, it can make bureaucratic sprawl kind of wider, broader, because it becomes so much easier to produce new documentation, go through new hurdles. So AI can churn out pages and pages. If I am working on a new infrastructure project, I can get it to churn out hundreds of kind of pages to go through new bureaucratic hurdles. So this time, how do we stop kind of admin and bureaucracy from expanding, kind of taking the gains from kind of this new technology? Thank you.
Well, you're reminding me of a conversation I had several years ago, which is we were anticipating and talking about a possible future universe where like I have my AI write a long email to Andre. Andre has his AI summarize it to him and then says something, and then his AI writes a long email back, and then my AI summarizes it to me, right? And it's kind of like, okay, this is a very weird loop. And is this a utopia, dystopia? What is this, right? As part of that. Because not just obviously can AI be used for generating tons of information, which it already is today, but it can also be used for synthesizing, summarizing. I mean, it's actually one of the use cases that I most often suggest to people is to say, take, for example, a technical paper that you might find difficult to read, put it into ChatGPT and say, explain this to me like I'm 12. It's a very useful feature. If you want to understand more about, like, for example, quantum computing or other kinds of things, this can be actually a very useful feature, speaking from experience. But also, it can also, like, for example, like reading through your inbox, saying these are the ones you most need to look at and all the rest. So the fact that it also creates a bunch of information doesn't necessarily mean that it creates us awash in information anxiety. Now, for administration and other kinds of things, I do think that part of like when I hope about what kinds of things that it could do is say, currently there's a whole bunch of work that is filling out, processing forms, et cetera. You generally speaking need the forms to be able to cross-check or see if something went wrong or if procedurals are checked. But could all of that be greatly accelerated by AI? Like, for example, within, kind of call it R&D research at, kind of in universities, I think one of the things that happens is you take, you put all this energy into selecting, training, building brilliant people who then have to spend a lot of time grant proposal writing. It's not that you say you don't want all the details and the grants and all, but if that whole process could be actually extremely accelerated in terms of time and speed, judgment, et cetera, that could then enable a bunch of work. Like one of the things I've done on occasion in my own philanthropy is to identify researchers who say, well, okay, I want to fund your hiring, this is pre-AI, grant writers so that you could spend more time doing the work and less grant writing as instances. So.
Going to go back to this section over here. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Rishi. I was also born in Stanford, Palo Alto, so that's pretty neat. My question kind of portrays around regulation. A lot of people mention regulation, but don't necessarily consider all the other variables that are taken into account, whether it be political regimes, certain other countries having different, outlooks on it. And I do think that it will create a lot of jobs. I think there's going to be a lot of research, a lot of safety measures around this technology. But I want to hear your opinion, if you have one. I know it's a very complicated matter. If you can kind of outline how regulation and it could integrate, whether that be through a U.S. perspective or another country's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm tempted to make a joke. That's a great question. And now, no, just because I'm going to answer a specific portion of your question. And so I'm just identifying I'm doing that, but it's an important question. So one of the things I think that regulators too often start with is they try to say, I'm a genius and I'm going to tell you exactly what you can do and not do. And that's my job. And that's what I should be doing. And I think that's a frequent mistake, most often made in the European Union. One of the reasons why the EU is well behind in a lot of different technology industries. And I think a good way to start is, how do I measure that? Like if I have a concern about a possible ill, how do I measure it? See what's actually happening, see if it's trending in a bad direction. And a good way to start as a regulator, like for example, if I said, hey, I'm concerned about the spread of misinformation within social networks, be like, okay, how would I come up with a measurement of that? And then I'd say, well, what I want to do as a first step is go to the social network and say, I want you to do these kinds of measurements negotiate, negotiate, negotiate. And then I want your auditors to have, put their stamp of approval, and I want you to provide those measurements to me so that I can see what's going on, right? Because you might say, hey, I think there's this real issue. Like, for example, I think there's a real bad issue with going on with misinformation around anti-vax. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can see it, right? And then I go, okay, because by the way, you might not even have to do anything to then implement another regulation, because once you have stimulated the business to go do the study of it, they may look at it and go, well, we don't like this. We're going to do something to fix it because we'd like to report back to you numbers that don't make us look like, bad actors, right? And that may be all you have to do. But of course, the frequent mistake that human beings do is go, well, I'm the regulator. I should tell you what you should be doing. It's like, really? You're the technological innovator? Really? You're the, it's foolishness. And so it's a good general approach to take is by starting by saying, how would I measure that? Let me get into the measurements. Let me start the measurements happening. Now, obviously, when there's something that's very, very bad happening, and sometimes you have to be like quick and crude, fine, right? Like take your opening addiction question. Like what I would say is, hey, if I was worried about addiction, it's like, okay, how would I measure that? I would like to start seeing some numbers on the addiction question, right? In a way that isn't like simply, well, are they spending more time using it? Maybe they're spending more time using it because it's really high quality and it's better than television or something else. So like that kind of thing would be the way that you would enter into that process. And that's the focus.
Mike Bloomberg likes to say is, in God we trust, all the others bring some numbers, right?
Yes.
We have many more questions and many more issues, but it is 7:15, and we promised Reid that we would release him at this time because he has to go off and join a board or something like that on Zoom. It all only remains to say thank you, thank you, thank you. This was fun. If you haven't read the book is out there. You can get it. And yes, I am being told from the back there that I should ask you to remain seated until Reid and his party can leave. But again, many thanks. And we perfectly understand. Thanks for joining us. And we hope to see you back here at the LSE sooner than later. Goodbye.